Hey, this is Drew Kaplan. Welcome to the 24th episode of the podcast and video for JewishDrinking.com. I, of course, am your host, and I'm very excited for this episode, which features Dr. Joshua Kulp, because we are discussing how whiskey became the catalyst for selling Chametz in one's own home. I found this fascinating, this idea of selling Chametz in our homes being instigated by whiskey. Like, literally it was whiskey, not beer, not any other beverage, not any other food. Whiskey. It was specifically whiskey that started it all. One quick little note, which matters nothing at all for anybody listening in the podcast version, but for the video viewers, you'll check this out. When I looked at the recording, I wasn't there visibly. You can still hear me. For those of you listening on the podcast, you can still hear me. Enjoy. You can at least see Dr. Kulp on this, but I want to make sure I get this visage of me. At least you can see me. So enjoy the show. I'm excited. We have Dr. Joshua Kulp on today to discuss selling of Chametz, and welcome to the show, Dr. Kulp.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So Dr. Kulp here is the Rosh Yeshiva and co-founder of the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem, where he's taught Talmud and Halakha for the last 20 years. He author of the Reconstructing the Talmud book in 2014, did an entire commentary in English on the entirety of the Mishnah, and many other things. The reason he's on today is he recently taught a 3-part course online on selling Chametz, Mecheret Chametz. So welcome again, Dr. Kulp. I'm really excited about this.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I might also point out I wrote a book called the Shechter Haggadah, a commentary on the Haggadah. So Pesach is sort of, although the Haggadah and Mechirat Chametz, selling of Chametz, isn't the same topic, it's sort of a specialty of mine. It keeps me very busy at this time of year.
Okay, fantastic. And so I'm curious, how did you come about doing the 3-part course on Mecheret Chametz, and also would you teach that again in the future?
Well, a friend of mine works for JTS, asked me to do some teaching for Pesach, and quite frankly, I've done a lot of teaching about the Seder, about the Haggadah, and I thought it'd be a great time to do something a little bit different. So this was already last year. He asked me maybe something on the rules of selling your Chametz. And, you know, I knew, like a general Jew knows that Jews sell chametz. I was sort of aware that this wasn't something that Jews had been doing for 2,000 years and that had changed. But I really didn't know that much. And when I started researching the subject in January, I quite frankly found it was one of the most fascinating topics in halachic history that I had ever learned. I don't know if I'm exaggerating, but it might be one of the greatest changes in modern halachic history outside of the framework of the reform and conservative movement. In other words, there's been a lot of changes between modernity, between reform, conservative, orthodox, but this is a change that's affected all Jews, Haredi, Orthodox, conservative, really any Jew who tries to get rid of their chametz has been massively affected by this change, which isn't that old. So it might be one of the most important halachic changes in modernity, or close to modernity.
That's really incredible. And I just want to say for the viewers out there, the reason we're talking about on JewishDrink.com, and this is something we're going to explore later in the episode, is it really started because of whiskey, right, Dr. Kulp?
Right. You might want to, I would suppose the listeners wondering, look, I want to hear about alcohol here, not about chametz. But of course, many of the most chametz-stick types of products are products that are drunk, like beer and whiskey. Although I did find one posek who said that whiskey is not actually full chametz. He didn't say you could drink it, but he considered it, it was interesting, he calls it zeya, which is like sweat. It's not an appetizing picture, but he imagined that whiskey was the sweat of the wheat or the barley that it's made out of.
Well, it's like the mist. Kind of like the mist.
It's not really the essence, although I say that, most authorities do not agree with it, and certainly I would not condone drinking whiskey on Pesach.
Yeah.
For sure.
So going back to you, I was enjoying your story of what you discovered, what you found along the way in studying Mecheret Chametz, selling Chametz. So what were some highlights for you? What were some of the big surprises and twists and turns in that?
Well, if you look in the early sources, and really it goes on for a long time, if you look from the Tosefta, from second century sources, really until the 16th century, you get a picture like this. Jews would sell chametz in a time of need. Let's say that the classic illustration is, let's say you're going on a trip and you need to bring provisions for longer than just Pesach. And you're worried, what are you going to eat after Pesach? So you bring on your trip with you chametz, you sell it to the non-Jew who's traveling with you, and you tell the non-Jew, I'll buy it back from you after Pesach. In other words, it was a once in a while kind of occurrence. Occasionally you get people selling chametz from their own homes, but only most early authorities, most Rishonim, think that this is not something you should do every year. It was certainly done individually. In other words, a Jew would probably take his chametz, bring it to a non-Jew, and tell him, look, if you buy this now, I'll buy it back from you later. Right? Not large quantities probably either. By the way, even though the sources don't talk about this, I've often wondered, what kind of chametz stays well in the ancient world without refrigeration, without preservatives? My guess is people baked bread every day, right? Or almost every day. They didn't bake bread, and they didn't have Wonder Bread that lasts for, I don't know, a few weeks. So we didn't have pasta. We didn't have crackers like we have. What kind of chametz would you need to sell so that you could buy it back later that's not going to go bad? The two prime categories are sourdough, that you would need for starting your bread again, and beer.
Yeah.
Right? And people drank a lot of beer, especially in places like England, Germany, northern countries, drank copious amounts of beer. I know you talked about it in Babylonia, was a beer drinking country. But in Germany and England, I remember seeing something in a book by Chaim Soloveitchik, who's the authority on wine and beer in the Middle Ages, talking about people drinking like 20 liters of beer a week. That's 3 liters of beer a day.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of beer. Now, it might not have been strong, but that's, to give you some context, in 500 milliliter big cans, that's 6 big cans of beer a day.
Wow.
Every day. That's a
You gotta
lot.
stay warm in the winter somehow, right?
Well, once you start drinking that much beer, I guess you just get used to it, to be honest with you. I mean, today we might just say, that's an alcoholic. And many people might have been alcoholics back then. Anyway, they needed a lot of beer. Beer, it won't stay forever, but it'll stay for a while, longer than bread.
Yeah.
So my guess is the background to selling chametz and even in an earlier period, for any reason, is mostly for beer, more for beer than for what we would consider bread.
Maybe sourdough, like you mentioned.
The sourdough, the starter dough too, right? That would last a long time, right? For sure, the starter dough as well.
Yeah.
That would
Can I
also,
go back?
Yeah.
You mentioned this Tosefta, which I think mostly in the Tannaitic and the early rabbinic stuff, there's an assumption you're getting rid of any chametz, bread, etc., right? And that's sort of a condition that if you happen to find yourself in this weird condition, but most people would just get rid of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a mitzvah to destroy your chametz. Most people would get rid of it. The Tosefta talks about somebody going on a boat with a non-Jew, which clearly is not something that was planned out. And he just he wants to make sure that he has chametz later on. This is not every year. The Tosefta also allows you to encourage the non-Jew to buy more than he really wants to. In other words, you say to him, instead of buying just a little bit of chametz, maybe for your own needs, buy a lot. Maybe I'll buy it back from you. But I think it's really worth emphasizing that it was something that was very direct. It wasn't probably a huge amount. It was done between one Jew and one non-Jew. And many Rishonim emphasize this over and over and over again. Not all Rishonim, but you're not allowed to do this every year. Right? They say that if you do this, not all Rishonim say this, but a lot of them say if you do this every year, you lose permission because then it becomes fake. Right?
But it sounds like for the medieval period that it started becoming a growing practice, that people were starting to, even just between them and their fellow Gentile, like their Gentile neighbors, to begin selling this, whether it was the bread, the sourdough bread, beer, or whatever else, right?
you do find that it increases. It's a debate among in the medieval period, and you find some sources that say, look, as long as it's a real sale, meaning the non-Jew really owns it, then it's okay to do this every year. And that seems to be the debate. Can you do this every year, or is it just something that can happen, what we call in Hebrew l'shat hatzorach, when it's really needed, or occasionally? But no one's really talking about, for the most part, they're talking about taking your bread or your chametz or your beer out of your possession, bringing it to the non-Jew's house, and promising him you'll buy it back afterwards. There might be a few glimmers of a little bit of leaving it in your own home and renting him the house or the room, but for the most part, you're talking about bringing it out to a non-Jew you know, and very, very individual. Nothing really at all similar to what we do today. Is it fake? It's a little fake, right? It's like a little cheating. That's what I would call it. Right? What we do today is a lot of, let's fess up to it. It's a lot of cheating. It's a big fiction what we do today. So this is where I think the alcohol comes in, right? The hard alcohol comes in. I think this is what's really interesting, is how the invention and the proliferation of a drink can have such a massive effect on halacha. It's a little bit like asking, like, what kind of how technology changes religion or Judaism. From what I remember, I'm not an expert on the history of alcohol, but from what I remember is that hard alcohol became popular in the world when British sailors started sailing around the world, because British sailors won't go anywhere unless they have enough alcohol to keep them going the whole trip. So when they were sailing to Spain or Portugal or even in the Mediterranean basin, all right, you can bring some beer, some wine, it's enough. What are you going to do when you go to the Americas? What are you going to do when you go to South Africa, Australia? And you can't bring enough beer. So if you want to get sailors to come, give them the hard alcohol, right? Got to keep the British sailors happy. Yeah. I also think that there was when they started putting lemon in it to keep away the bad taste, they then discovered that people who were drinking lemon alcohol didn't get scurvy. They didn't know that it was because of the vitamins in the lemons. I think they thought it's just lemon alcohol prevents scurvy, which is a big problem because they couldn't get fresh fruit. So I love looking at these like ways that the history of alcohol affects our lives in so many different ways. I think it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So that was 16th century, maybe late 15th century.
So the first we read about it in halachic sources is a commentary on the Torah written by Rabbi Yoel Sirkis in the late 16th, early 17th century. He wrote a massive commentary, very important halachic work on a book called the Torah, which was also an important halachic work. And he's the first person who starts mentioning this leniency. And he says in our
wait. So I just meant the whiskey being in the world in the late 15th, maybe into the early 16th century, right? Just in general.
Yeah, I think it was around earlier. I think like most things, the Chinese invented it way before the Europeans did. I think it started proliferating. I think the technology was there, but it's proliferating and becoming much more common in the 15th, 16th century, right around the same time when British explorers were starting to make their way around the world. And I believe the two of those things were tied into each other.
I know you just started mentioning Rabbi Sirkis in the early 17th century. So I do want to give a quick little plug to an episode, 2 weeks ago, the episode featuring Professor Adam Teller on Polish Jews in the 17th and 18th century liquor trade. So for those interested in a little bit more context, you can go check that episode out.
So the Bach, he's always called the Bach after his book. He writes in this region. He's living in Krakow, I believe. He lived all over Eastern Europe. He wandered around a little bit. Where most of their trade, it's very interesting. He says most of their trade is what they call in Hebrew yain sraf, burnt wine, which you're familiar with. In English, we now call that brandy, which comes from the word bront vine. Bront vine is burnt wine. Why is it called burnt wine? I suppose, I'm not sure about this, but I suppose because when you drink it, it creates a nice burning sensation. Interestingly, he says most Jewish trade is in brandy, and Jews are massively owning distilleries. He says that in our area, you can't take all of your chametz, all of your brandy out of your house and bring it to the non-Jew. Therefore, he starts to allow you to sell your chametz and leave it in your own home. Right? That's one of the big changes in the history of the sale of chametz. Instead of bringing it to the non-Jew, you basically sell the non-Jew the chametz while it's still in your house. But that became so because brandy. And what's interesting is you do read here and there in sources of cases where the non-Jew thinks that he actually owns the brandy and starts drinking it. You can imagine a small distillery owner not wanting to bring the brandy to the non-Jew's house because it's going to get consumed.
But is brandy involving grains?
I think that they made it. Yeah, I think that they made it from grain for sure. For sure. I don't. That's a good question because today brandy is often made from wine.
Right. Or
but I
some other fruit product, right?
Right. It's true. I imagine like they probably called it like they probably didn't have another word. This is my assumption for it for alcohol, either wine or beer or something like that. So they probably just called it burnt. In other words, wine becomes something associated with alcohol. But for sure, they were making it from grain. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So in the 2 weeks ago's episode with Professor Teller, he mentioned that rye was a huge grain for them, and they often would have excess rye grain.
Right.
They probably made it with rye.
That's right. That's right. What's also interesting is there's another thing that starts to happen. Jews were known to be merchants. Jews weren't landowners. But if you own a distillery, there's a lot of waste products, a lot of wasted grain. So what are you going to do with all that wasted grain? You get animals to eat it. So Jews started owning animals to eat it. So now you have another halacha question, which remains a thorny halacha question to this day. What do you do with your animals that you have to feed during Pesach? Can you feed them grain? So there are a bunch of tshuvot, halachic responsa, about whether or not you can sell your animals to the non-Jew and allow the non-Jew to feed your animals with your grain. Usually the answer is actually no, but I don't think the Jews owned a lot of animals until this period. They would own maybe a little bit for personal use, but Jews weren't known to be like livestock raisers in the medieval period. Again, for personal use, for your own milk, maybe for your own a little bit of wool, but large flocks of animals go hand in hand with owning a distillery. So you can see one little change.
Wait, can I just also pause on this? Which is, it's just even just his recognition that most of the Jews that he knows in his Polish area are involved somehow in the selling or the buying of this whiskey.
Right. Well, I think, and I imagine what happens, you see this happening a lot throughout halachic history, and I assume in secular history too, is that when things are used a lot by a lot of people, they become commodities and used in trade in place of cash. So Professor Chaim Soloveitchik talks about this in wine in a much earlier period, that wine in the Middle Ages was used like cash. We take money for granted, how easy it is to exchange everything for money. But in the pre-modern world, you had to worry about this, especially with a fracturization of kingdoms. You had to worry that your money wouldn't be accepted in other places, and money could easily lose value. Yeah. We have a much greater reliance on money than people did in pre-modernity. So what you can imagine why whiskey trade would be so advantageous, because it's not, you don't need a lot of it. Wine is going to be cheaper than whiskey because whiskey is essentially concentrated alcohol. So when you're trading commodities, you want to get the highest value per ounce of product, right? Diamonds, gold, silver. But when you're talking about food, what costs more? When you think about it, what costs more lasts longer, right? Whiskey
Yeah.
will last for a very long time than whiskey or hard alcohol. Really, I mean, wine would go bad extremely quickly. Professor Soloveitchik talks a lot about this in his book, that basically they were drinking vinegar a lot of the time. They didn't have the technology to seal wine. The
Oh, wow.
barrel let a lot of air in there. And so if you have, I don't know, $1,000, say, in wine, you better get rid of that quickly because it's going to lose its value. It's going to drop precipitously. Whiskey, I don't know if this was true back then, but whiskey gets more expensive and gets better with aging. Right.
Right.
So,
So another thing that also Rabbi Circus writes is that it's impossible. It's just not possible for people to remove all of this whiskey outside of their house, which is such a shocking, like something has clearly changed from whatever the previous, not just that most Jews are involved in this trade, but that you just can't remove it out of your house. Like you used to be able to sell it to the Gentile and he takes it to his house.
I mean, you have an entire production facility there. I don't know how big these were. This wasn't, Glenlivet and Glenfiddich size places, but they would have been big enough for, I imagine, a large family to earn a living off of. I suppose I haven't done this yet, but it's one of my hopes to do in the future. You go to Scotland and you see local family distilleries. Things that you can't get anywhere else. All you can do is get it right there. I imagine these were even a little bit smaller than that because they probably were trading mostly local, but they might have been owned by a few people. So they were clearly enough whiskey that people just couldn't move it. I also think there's an issue of the trust thing there. He mentions that he talks about writing a document of sale. So the history of the sale of chametz is people want to sell their chametz. They want to get rid of it. They don't want to transgress the laws of Pesach, but they don't want to lose it forever. And the rabbis want to make what we call in Hebrew the kinyan, the acquisition, as real as possible because they're bothered by the fiction of it. But if they make it too real, then the goy might say, look, I have a document written in Polish that says I own the Jews' whiskey, and now I'm going to go to the non-Jewish court and say, look, he sold me his whiskey. So he talks about not writing a document. Without a document, you might want to do like a way of kinyan, a way of acquiring something that'll make sure that the goy knows that he's buying it in a Jewish sense, but he doesn't really own it. Of course, you're better off doing this with a non-Jew you trust. You don't want to sell your chametz to a non-Jew you don't trust. So it's very interesting that that attempt to make sure that it's a real sale, but not to go too far to make sure that people don't actually drink the Jewish whiskey.
Do you want to transition to how it develops?
Well, it develops a little bit in the modern period. In the modern period, what you have is more of like a halachic developments that when you leave things up to individual people, they may not do it in the best halachic way from a rabbinic perspective. And when I was teaching this class, this is, I think, one of the interesting tensions is sort of the way that people act versus the way that rabbis want them to act. Rabbis would like people to act according to the highest halachic standard. Yeah. And the way people act is the way that makes sense to them in their own minds. We're also used to a community. If you want to ask a rabbi what to do, now you can go to the internet and find 1 million rabbinic opinions in 10 seconds. It didn't used to be that way in the ancient world. There are interesting sources. Eventually, this involved what changed is that we started doing collective sales to get rid of the individual Jew selling his own chametz to a non-Jew. So we started doing collective sales. This sort of standardized the process. But you find sources in this in-between period of people trying to write up documents who don't know how to write, who don't know how to sign their name, who don't know how to do this. Right? There are a lot of people who they forget to sign the documents. They really don't know how to really do anything. There's stories about Jews who live in communities where there's virtually no one around who knows how to write, let alone read, right? And clearly there was no rabbi living right near him. There's also a process at this period in the history of Judaism where a lot of the larger yeshivot are forming and sort of taking away the intelligentsia from their communities. If it used to be an intelligent person in every community, now they've all gone to study in the great yeshivas in Lithuania, and you're left at home with really, Tevye, if you will, right? Imagine Tevye's running the show. And Tevye, he knows a little bit, but he's no Talmid Chacham. And he probably doesn't, he stopped going to school at what, grade 5, something like that? I don't remember the exact song. So you find a lot of people sort of winging it in this period, and then the rabbis come in and make everything much more standardized. And then you get interesting questions that you still have in modern tshuvot that are, what happens if I forgot to sell my chametz? I told a student of mine that some of my students are studying to be rabbis. I said, the most important thing you need to know is the Jew who calls you up either during Pesach or Erev Pesach in the middle of the day, after the time you're supposed to sell your chametz. Rabbi, I forgot to sell my chametz. What do I do now? Right. That is, if you can tell him pour all your whiskey, and he's always going to be asking about whiskey. No one's going to care if they have to throw away some crackers and pasta, right? Any rabbi can tell the Jew, throw away your crackers and pasta, get rid of them as soon as possible. Yeah. You won't lose a congregant that way, right? If your congregant is the head of the whiskey club or the Kiddush club, and he's got, I don't know, $2,000 collection of whiskeys that he's been saving up for all these years, and he forgot to sell his chametz, what do you do, right?
Yeah,
that's a thorny question. I don't want to give an answer to it because you should go learn, but that's a thorny question with real high stakes. Stakes. And I also,
which by the way, I think is incredible that what started this in the early 17th century, whiskey as the catalyst for it all, still remains with us as being the central, reason for still doing this.
Yeah, I think that, in the modern period, some people actually sell things that they probably don't need to sell because they're not really chametz. It's just easier. Once you're selling everything, you just sell all of your stuff, all of your food you sell. But when if you go through your cabinet and you ask yourself, what's really chametz? And what are the things that I don't eat on Pesach because it doesn't have a hechsher on? But I know that the canned peaches are not chametz. I know that the rice, well, maybe Ashkenazim don't eat it, but rice isn't chametz. There's a lot of things on your shelf that you sell or you don't eat on Pesach, not really chametz. The chametz isn't so valuable. Really, what you need to sell is the booze. And there are, in teaching this and talking about it with people, I very frequently encounter people who said things, we don't sell our chametz anymore. They wanted to get into the spirit of the holiday. And they said, like, the original thing was not to sell all of your chametz. You only did it occasionally for great need, and we don't have a great need. But my chavruta pointed out to me, he said, oh, it's easy for so-and-so to do that because they don't drink. Anybody who drinks, as probably is true, my guess is true for many of the people who listen to this podcast, is that they drink. Otherwise, and if you drink, you probably have a lot of friends that drink, right? Yeah. No fun alone, although in today's day, we are drinking a lot alone, but
sadly true.
Yeah, that's the reality that we face now. So the people that you hang out with are people who drink. They're the ones who have that whiskey collection. They're the ones who maybe not so much beer, but they have a collection of gin. They got a collection of bourbon. They got a collection of, that's the kind of stuff I drink. Maybe some vodka. Those people are going to be selling their chametz. I don't know any of my drinking friends who drink all of their chametz before Pesach. It's just, what do you do after Pesach, right? That was also another thing was interesting here. Yeah. In America, so I live in Israel, in case that wasn't clear from your introduction. In Israel, Pesach can end Friday night. In other words, Friday can be the last day of Pesach. And if you sold your booze, right, Shabbat is not Pesach. And you're going to shul. Who doesn't want booze to be the first thing that you have after Pesach is over. So I was always really unsure about, can you drink your whiskey or your beer or your chametz liquor on Saturday when Pesach is over? Again, this is not really relevant if you live outside of Israel, because this can't happen outside of Israel, but it is relevant if you're visiting Israel.
I mean,
Probably not.
it's not like you. I mean, you could still have tequila, vodka. There's plenty of liqueurs that are still kosher with Pesach, right? You're
You
not.
could,
It's not a
but
terrible position to be in.
I don't know about you. Well, you could say the same thing about regular eating, right? Pesach's over.
Yeah.
People don't want to eat the Pesach cakes anymore when Pesach's over. People don't want any more potatoes and chicken and meat. Everybody wants pizza when Pesach's over. You want the bread. People the day after Pesach are ravenously eating pizza as if it's like the greatest thing on earth. For drinkers, I think that's true of alcohol, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the tequila and the gin, but I want my beer and my whiskey when Pesach's over.
Which, by the way, Rabbi Isserlis, writing on the Shulchan Aruch, says we're accustomed to have beer for Havdalah after Pesach.
Exactly. So that's in Chutzlar. It's outside of Israel where it's Saturday night. But he's right, because that's like the greatest time to have beers, right when Pesach's over. But so it's relevant there too. But it's relevant because on Shabbat it seems like you can't really buy your chametz back from a non-Jew on Shabbat, right? You just can't buy things on Shabbat. So how do you get your chametz back when Shabbat has already started? So what a lot of poskim imagine is that you're not really buying your chametz back from the non-Jew, but really the chametz is like you're collecting. He owes you a debt. He paid you. Let's say your chametz was worth, I don't know, $1 million. Everyone's chametz is worth $1 million, and he paid, I don't know, $100 for it. And now he owes all the Jews who sold him his chametz the rest of the money. We know he's not going to really pay you back. So what do you do to start collecting your debt? You start taking the chametz from him. And he's okay with that because he doesn't want to really pay you all the money. So you're actually taking, you go to your whiskey closet, you drink, you pour yourself a glass. Again, Pesach is over, so it's okay to do this. Yeah. As you pick it up, you're recovering your chametz from the non-Jew such that he owes you a little bit less, and he is okay with that. I thought it was a clever understanding of how you can drink it. And I don't know, it happened here. I live in Modi'in, and this happened like 3 out of like 5 years. Pesach ended on Friday. It happened a lot. Wow. And there's the head Sephardi rabbi of Modi'in was evidently spotted drinking whiskey at Kiddush on Shabbat after Pesach was over. So after that, everybody was well, the chief rabbi of Modi'in's doing it, we can do it. And that cold beer really tastes good when Pesach's over. Really good. Before closing off this episode with Dr. Kulp, I just want to give a quick little preview for next week's episode with Rabbi Ilana Suskin. We're talking about the danger of demons with the 4 cups of wine at the Seder.
The fact that he's chatting with his friend, Yosef the demon, is just like a lot. I just find that incredibly interesting that no one says anything about it.
Dr. Kulp, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast episode, talking about whiskey as being the catalyst for selling of chametz. So thank you so much. It's been great. I'm a big podcast listener, but this is my first time on a podcast. So thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun. My pleasure. And Chag Kosher V'Sameach. Chag Sameach to everybody. Hope everybody is safe and healthy and able to enjoy Pesach despite our difficult circumstances.